Good afternoon, class, and as you can see by the making of this video, I'm still not going to be in Tuesday. So I'm a little bit of pain. I actually got to get some work done on my cast because it's not set up right. It's digging into my leg pretty bad. So I will be back on Wednesday. Everything will be good to go, so I will see you guys on Wednesday. So instead of turning you guys loose on the computers again, let's actually get going on some of this evolution stuff and start our discussion. As we're going through today's PowerPoint, which I need to give credit to Kim Foglia, who was a very predominant individual that in the AP community. These are materials that she had available for people to use. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of years ago, and so I want to make sure she gets credit for providing these materials that we'll be using throughout this particular unit. All right, and so we're going to be looking at some of the Darwin stuff. I'm going to go very quickly through a lot of these slides because a lot of these were covered in that evolution video that you guys already watched on the PBS video that you watched last week. And so a lot of the background stuff here, if I click quickly, this because it's not really that important for you. So when we look at some of the people that influenced Charles Darwin and got him to be interested in wanting to study evolution and then develop what we now know the theory of natural selection, there's a number of individuals that are part of this. You guys can get this information from the book, so I'm going to skip through it relatively quickly. I started with Aristotle. He had a way of saying things are fixed, but there's similarities between things. And then the one thing I do want to take a moment and touch on is taxonomy, because I know in middle school we didn't hit that as hard as we should have. And so I want to make sure you guys get caught up to speed on some of the things that you're going to be hearing. A guy by the name of Linnaeus is credited with coming up with something we call the binomial nomenclature system of classification. And all this is saying that we're going to give every organism their own two-part scientific name that is the same across all languages so that we can speak internationally when we're talking about classification concepts. And so we still use this system today. And all the two-part scientific naming system is you take the genus of the organism, you make that the first name, and you make the species name be the second name. So he also is credited with coming up with basically a hierarchy of how we classify organisms. It starts at all living things can be classified into one of three domains. There's challenges in terms of the number of domains that it should be. We'll steer away from that right now. The domains can be broken down into kingdoms. Once again, it matters who you talk to, how many kingdoms there are. The state of Michigan wants us to teach the 5-kingdom system, which is pretty archaic in my opinion, but I got to do what I got to do. And then the kingdoms get broken down into phylums, phylums into classes, classes into orders, orders into families, families into genuses, and genuses get broken down into species. All right, and the species can be further broken down into subspecies, or what we commonly refer to as breeds. All right, and so when we look at this system, this is how we can take an organism once it's been discovered and we classify it. They're not born with this classification. This classification thing is a human-made concept, but it makes us to be able to look at evolutionary changes that have occurred in organisms over the history of time. So you can see an example of a classification tree here. And then in middle school, elementary school, you often come up with little silly sayings to help you remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Mine that I always used when I taught this in middle school was King Philip came over from Germany swimming, but you can see some other ones listed there at the top as well. All right, when we look at the lion up here in the upper right-hand corner, it belongs to the Animalia kingdom, phylum Chordata. They belong to the mammalian class, Carnivora order. They're part of the Felidae family, Panthera genus, and their species name is Leo. So the scientific name for that particular lion is Panthera leo. All right, and so a genus is really a group of closely related species, and then the species is the unique kind of each bear. You can liken this to your name. You have everybody in your family has the same last name, assuming you have the same father, and that's kind of the last name is similar to your genus, whereas the species name is similar to your first name, and that's how we use to classify you. For us, there's a reason why we're called Homo sapiens. It's because our genus name is Homo and our species name is Sapien. All right, and so when we look at, I mentioned the domains here. Like I said, I'm going to skip this one for now. There's other people that came in and had an influence on some of Darwin's thinking. This Cuvier guy by the name of Hutton. Gradualism we'll come back to in just a few moments. Lyell and his uniformitarianism, and then Malthus was a big one that had an impact on it. And then Lamarck had a big thing. And Lamarck's line of thinking is really the line of thinking that existed in the scientific world prior to Darwin coming out with the theory of natural selection. And what Lamarck said was it's either you use it or you lose it. You have these particular functions for you. You have these particular traits, and you will use those traits. And as long as you use them, you will keep them. If you don't use them, then you're going to lose them. And now, through natural selection, we've been able to figure out that that's not actually accurate. Because we know acquired traits, which are some of the things that you do gain over time, those can't be passed on to offspring. Arnold didn't pass on his buffness to his kids just because he was buff, which would be kind of nice if that were the case. Makes me wish my dad would have lifted a little bit more when he was younger. And then there's this new thing called epigenetics, where we're looking at the impact that acquired traits have on actual genetics. And so that's something, hopefully, when we get into the DNA technology unit, we'll get a chance to talk about those. There's a lot of job fields starting to open up that are in the epigenetics line of work. All right, and so we now know that Lamarck's line of thinking is inaccurate. And so then you guys already watched the video on Darwin, so I'm not going to go into the history of Darwin. He worked out of the Galapagos Islands, that's where he did the majority of his research. And he saw that there's many species there that were similar to those on the mainland, but they were slightly different as well. And so they evolved from the ones that were on the mainland. They had slightly different traits. Then he saw that some of the organisms all on the same island have different traits based upon different character, or based upon different environments that existed within the chain of the Galapagos Islands. All right, and then he got forced to release his information a little bit earlier than he really wanted to, because another person, Sir Alfred Wallace, was releasing his theory of evolution around the same time. And so in 1959, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was released. If you ever get a chance to try to read it, good luck. I've tried reading it on multiple occasions. It's very thick, but it has some interesting parts to it too. All right, so now let's look at some of the things that Darwin was able to figure out as part of his voyage on the Beagle. All right, so what we're going to start doing at this point is there's going to be little video prompts. I'm going to tell you to pause the video here and then watch the video, and I'll have a Google Doc that'll be set up so you can access the video. So the first video I want you to watch is the one that is titled, Isn't Evolution Just a Theory? So at this point, go ahead and pause the video and go to that link and watch that video. And when you're done with the video, come on back to this presentation. So, hopefully at this point you've been able to see that, yeah, it is just a theory, but the way that we define theory in layman's speak is completely different than the way we define theory in science. It is just a theory, but in science, a theory is something that has been proven over and over and over and over again and has never been disproven. Therefore, yeah, it is just a theory, but a scientific theory. All right, similar theories. There's the cell theory out there. Nobody disputes that all living organisms are made up of cells. Nobody disputes that atoms make up all of matter. Nobody disputes that things fall because of gravity. Those are, once again, theories that have been tested over and over and over and over and over again and proven to be true every single time. Well, the theory of evolution fits into this as well. All right, so some vocabulary that's associated with the theory of natural selection. We've got to start by talking about what an adaptation is. This is an inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. The key there is it is inherited. So many people think adaptations can just happen on their own. They can't happen on their own. You are born with them. You either have it or you don't, and you have an advantage because of having that in that particular set of circumstances. And we'll get into some different examples of that. And you can see the picture here with the bunny on the right side of the screen. It has a white color. It didn't change to being white. It has white coloring, which helps it to blend in better in the snow. Therefore, it's an advantage for that particular organism. It didn't change from being brown to white. It was already white from the start. More evolutionary stuff she doesn't learn. She must not have the trait to stay off the counters. All right, also part of Darwin's theory is there's always going to be an overproduction of offspring. Organisms are going to have the capacity to make more offspring than what are actually going to continue to exist. So we always have overproduction. Because of this overproduction and because of availability of resources, there's always going to be a struggle for existence. So members of each species are going to compete with one another for food, space, particular niches, other resources as well. And once again, if I'm going fast, I'm doing that on purpose because this is going to be a long video, so feel free to pause this as needed. There's always going to be genetic variation. If you don't have genetic variation, you're not going to get changes in a species over time, which is what evolution is. If everything's the same, it's not going to change. So you need to have variations. You need to have different traits that are based upon the genes. All right, so you're going to find this naturally in all populations. Not every zebra has the same stripe pattern as every other. Ladybugs, so you can see here with the spots and the coloration, there's variations there. So we need to have genetic variation that increases the biodiversity as well. All right, and so because of all this, some organisms in a population are going to be more likely to survive than others. So the Triceratops, yeah, that didn't do so well. The chicken with the longer neck for the farmer that's going out to get dinner, yeah, that's not so good for you either. All right, and so when we look at this, what we're really talking about, the ability for an organism to survive and then reproduce, we call this fitness. All right, we look at evolution from the population standpoint. We look at adaptations among the species. We look at fitness with the particular individuals. All right, so fitness is the ability to not only survive, but then also be able to reproduce. All right, and so this is where the whole thought of survival of the fittest came from. But please recognize, survival of the fittest is not just surviving. That's great if you survive. You have to be able to reproduce as well. If you can just survive but not reproduce, then you're not really going to be spreading those traits on to the next generation, which is the whole point behind evolution. All right, so over time, natural selection is going to result in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. All right, and these changes are then going to increase the species' fitness within that particular environment. All right, so we're looking at changes in inherited characteristics. And it's something we're going to be playing with. We're going to play with something called Hardy-Weinberg theory, and we're going to look at how those traits and how those particular alleles will pass along throughout the generations. And that's when we get into population genetics, which we'll get into after the theory of natural selection here. So the next video I want you to watch is the one on how does evolution really work. I'm just going to show you some examples of evolution at work. At this point, go ahead and pause this video and go to the links that were provided. All right, let's move on. So I made this point just a moment ago, but now that we have the notes to go back or to follow it up, populations are the things that evolve, not individuals. So natural selection works on heritable traits within a population. It has to be favorable in one environment, but here's the thing. It may not be as favorable in another environment. We saw that white bunny earlier. If that white bunny were in the desert, that white would make it stick out like a sore thumb. Therefore, it's not going to be as favorable of a trait, and therefore it's going to have less likelihood to survive. And the brown bunnies are going to have a higher likelihood of surviving in that particular habitat. All right, and so part of what goes with Darwin's theory as well is something called descent with modification. And what this suggests is that each species has descended with changes from other species over time. So new species evolve from previously existing species, and these new species just have changes in them compared to the species from which they evolved from. So this is the idea that suggests that all living species are related to one another and that we all have come from a common ancestor. All right, and so just think about this a second. What do oranges, broccoli, and butterball turkey, since we're getting close to Thanksgiving, what do these all have to do with evolution? You're going to find out here in just a few minutes. So you've already spent some time looking at some of the evidence of evolution. You've already had you watch a couple videos. And so just to put those into a list for your notes purposes, artificial selection, which is going to come back to the previous slide. The fossil record helps to provide evidence of evolution. Geographic distribution, anatomical homologies, embryology, molecular homologies, which is a big one. And we can actually see natural selection happen. And we'll spend, when I come back, spend some time looking at, here's some real life examples of natural selection happening in particular environments. So let's start by looking at artificial selection. Nature gives the variation to everything through mutations, through sexual reproduction because of the crossing over that happens during meiosis. And we as humans, we see these things, hey, I like that trait, I like that trait. Well, because I like those traits, I'm going to make these breed together, and now we're getting this particular set of alleles in this particular population. That's what artificial selection is. When we select for the traits that we desire, and we make things reproduce in order to reproduce those results of those traits. So, for example, we've selected cows for breeding that will produce more milk. We've artificially selected to make it so that turkeys are bigger than what they are in the natural environment to provide greater amounts of breastfeeding, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm a white meat guy. And we do this with plants all the time. And we eat different parts of the different plants here as well. So you can see in the picture here some of the different parts of the plant that you guys typically eat. So it's not just plants, and it's animals. Think about all the different breeds of dogs and the different breeds of cats that are out there. Yes, we selected for those traits. We pay big money for some of those traits. Okay? And so if artificial selection has caused so much change in a relatively short period of time, some of these breeds of dogs have only been around for a couple hundred years. Why can't major changes happen over thousands of generations? Well, the thing is, they do. So what do broccoli and butterball turkeys have to do with evolution? Well, guys, we're selecting in our farms, and we're causing crosses to occur that wouldn't naturally happen. That's going to make it so that we produce bigger turkeys, we produce bigger heads of broccoli, so that we can put more on our dinner tables. All right, so the next one I want you to watch is how do we know evolution happens? So you can go ahead and pause this video a moment and watch that video, and come back to this as soon as you're done watching that video. All right, now the fossil record provides evidence that organisms have changed over time. We can look at fossils. We know about rock formations. We know how to do what we call relative dating. And no, I'm not talking about dating people that live north of White Cloud. I'm talking, that's part of your family. I'm talking about being able to date the rock formations based upon their location in a layer of rock. Well, we know how sedimentation works. And so we can go through and date the rocks, and based upon where the fossils are found within the rocks, that tells us of the approximate age of those particular fossils. All right, a big example is when we're looking for some of the transitional fossils. Now, the Tiktaalik is a pretty popular one that's been recently discovered, one of the first fish to walk out of water. And so we wouldn't have a fossil record, we wouldn't have all this great evidence of evolution occurring if it weren't for the fossil record. And you get your anthropologists that really know how to dig this stuff up and take a look at some of the morphology and some of the changes that have happened over time. So why don't you guys take a moment and watch the BBC Tiktaalik video. And at this point, I'm going to stop this video, and when you're done watching the Tiktaalik video, load up video 2 of this lesson, and you guys can start video 2.